Imagine this. It's the year 1665. You're a foreign ambassador, summoned to the court of the most powerful monarch in Europe. As you step through the grand, echoing halls of the royal palace in Madrid, you expect to encounter a man who radiates absolute authority. But what awaits you is something that will haunt your memory for weeks. A king cannot close his mouth. His jaw droops open like an unhinged door. When he tries to speak, his words are reduced to garbled noises and gurgling sounds. His body is so misshapen, so frail, that he resembles something out of a fever dream more than a ruler of an empire. Among his own people, he's whispered about with a chilling nickname, El Hechizado, the Bewitched. But the truth is far more disturbing. No one dared to say it aloud, yet everyone knew Charles II of Spain wasn't the victim of a magical curse. The real curse came from within, from his own family. This is the story of how one of Europe's most powerful dynasties slowly destroyed itself, ultimately placing a broken man on the throne, a man whose tragic existence would spark one of the deadliest wars in European history. Before we dive deeper into this forgotten chapter of suffering and survival, take a moment to subscribe and hit the like button if you're refascinated by the hidden truths of the past. And please, leave a comment sharing where you're listening from. I think it's extraordinary that across continents and time zones, we're connected by our shared curiosity about history's buried horrors. To understand the full tragedy of Charles II, we must first step into the twisted ideology of the Habsburg dynasty, a family that, for over 200 years, ruled an empire stretching from Spain to the Philippines, from Austria to the Netherlands. This was a realm where, quite literally, the sun never set. But such immense power came at a horrifying cost. The Habsburgs became obsessed, not with conquest, but with blood. They clung to a warped belief in maintaining a pure bloodline. To them, marrying royalty wasn't enough. The ideal marriage was to someone already within the family. Uncles married nieces. Cousins wed cousins. And when family trees became too tangled to track, they simply drew tighter loops. The result was nothing short of a genetic nightmare. Charles II had an inbreeding coefficient of 0.254, meaning his genes were more homozygous than the child of a brother and sister. But Charles wasn't the product of one single generation of incest. His condition was the accumulated consequence of centuries of dynastic self-destruction. Charles, too, wasn't just unlucky. He was the tragic conclusion of 11 consecutive generations of cousin marriages. And here's where it becomes truly disturbing. Most people have 16 unique great-grandparents. Charles had only 6. His family tree wasn't a tree at all. It was a tangled spiderweb, with the same names appearing again and again in different roles. Take Anna of Austria, for example. She was Charles's aunt, grandmother, and great-grandmother, all at once. Philip II, another royal ancestor, held the titles of his grandfather, great-grandfather, and even great-great-grandfather. Modern geneticists have determined that Charles had less genetic variation than a child born to parents who were full siblings. But this wasn't the result of one isolated choice. It was the cumulative outcome of centuries of deliberate intermarriage, a slow and methodical purge of genetic diversity from the royal bloodline. And make no mistake, the Habsburgs knew exactly what they were doing. As early as the 1500s, court advisors were warning the family about the dangers of inbreeding. Medical records showed a sharp rise in miscarriages, infant deaths, and birth defects among royal children. Spanish physicians kept documenting alarming patterns, and yet nothing changed. In fact, the Habsburgs did the opposite. They didn't distance themselves from family when arranging marriages. They drew closer. Advisors suggested caution, but the family consistently chose tighter blood ties. Generation after generation, they observed their children being born with increasingly severe deformities, yet they refused to abandon the practice. The infamous Habsburg jaw became more exaggerated with each generation. Children suffered developmental delays. Some couldn't walk until years later than expected. Infertility became common. Sudden, unexplained deaths occurred with tragic frequency. Still, the dynasty persisted. They were so consumed by the fear of sharing power with outsiders that they were willing to sacrifice their own descendants, again and again, to preserve the illusion of a pure royal line. When Philip IV of Spain, Charles's father, finally realized his son was gravely deformed, his first instinct wasn't to seek help. It wasn't compassion. It wasn't concern. It was denial. Instead of seeking help, Philip IV gave a chilling order. All portraits of his son were to be destroyed, and no one was ever to speak of the child's condition outside the palace walls. The truth was far too shameful for the most powerful family in Europe. That silence would become a curse of its own. This secrecy created a tragic cycle, with each generation of Habsburg rulers more genetically damaged than the last. Yet the family's relentless obsession with appearances meant that no one could acknowledge the growing disaster, let alone intervene to stop it. When Charles II was born on November 6, 1661, the mood in the palace was anything but celebratory. The midwives stood frozen in silence. There were no cheers of joy, no church bells ringing to herald the arrival of a future king. Only a cold, creeping sense of dread spread through the royal chambers. The newborn was so grotesquely deformed that some believed he had been stillborn. His head was swollen and oversized, disproportionately large for his frail, miniature body. His eyes were spaced unnaturally far apart, giving him an eerie, otherworldly appearance. And his mouth, that gaping, unshut mouth, already hung open, frozen in a lifeless expression that would plague him for the rest of his days. But no one dared speak of it. The midwives were threatened with death if they revealed what they had witnessed. Physicians were coerced into signing declarations that the infant prince was perfectly normal and in good health. Behind the palace gates, the royal propaganda machine began its desperate work, crafting a public illusion while concealing the truth at all costs. Charles's early childhood was little more than prolonged suffering. He couldn't lift his own head until he was 6. He didn't walk until he was 8. He couldn't speak clearly until the age of 10. Every developmental milestone, things most children achieve in infancy, became impossible mountains for him to climb. And perhaps the most devastating truth of all, Charles seemed to know something was deeply wrong. Court physicians recorded that the child would cry uncontrollably for hours at a time, with no physical cause they could identify, as if he were trapped in a body that constantly betrayed him. He couldn't sleep well due to his jaw deformity. His oversized tongue would slide back during the night, blocking his airway and leaving him gasping for breath. The royal wet nurses were terrified. Many refused to care for the child. Some were caught crossing themselves nervously before entering his room, as if they feared not a prince, but a curse in human form. Some palace servants whispered prayers under their breath, as though they were standing in the presence of something unholy. The royal household, according to surviving records from the time, was gripped by quiet dread. Fear seeped into every corridor. Servants drew lots to decide who would have to enter the prince's room. Guards stationed nearby reported hearing strange sounds at night, not the cries of a child, but something less human, more unsettling. When Charles turned 5, the court commissioned his first official portrait. The painter, Juan Carrigo de Miranda, arrived expecting a routine royal sitting, a young proud heir to the Spanish crown. What he encountered instead left him shaken to his core. He initially refused to finish the portrait. In private letters to his wife, Miranda described the young prince as more beast than boy, and confessed that he suffered from nightmares for weeks after their first meeting. When the painting was finally completed, every artistic trick was used to soften Charles's features, to disguise the extent of his deformities. And yet, despite all the flattery and careful brushwork, the truth still bled through the canvas. What disturbed Miranda most were Charles's eyes. In them, he saw a spark, a sharpness, a tragic awareness, trapped inside a broken body. The child seemed to understand he was different, that people recoiled from him, but he couldn't grasp why. In desperation, the royal court crafted a careful illusion, a royal fantasy in which Charles appeared to be a normal prince. Ceremonies were choreographed down to the smallest detail. Furniture was custom-built to hide his physical condition during official visits. His food was prepared in soft, paste-like consistency, cut into tiny portions, not for delicacy, but to prevent choking and drooling, which had become common occurrences due to his severe jaw deformity. But children have a way of revealing what adults try to conceal. When Charles was 7 years old, an Italian ambassador brought his young son to court for a formal introduction. The moment the boy laid eyes on the Spanish prince, he screamed in terror, shouting in his native tongue, "Mastro! Mastro! Monster! Monster!" The incident triggered a diplomatic scandal, but more importantly, it shattered the fragile illusion that Charles's condition could be kept secret any longer. The so-called Habsburg jaw was not just an unfortunate family trait. In Charles II, it had become a full-blown genetic collapse. His lower jaw jutted forward so dramatically that even when his mouth was fully closed, there was still a visible gap, large enough for coins to pass through. Modern medical analysis suggests that Charles suffered from severe mandibular prognathism, along with macroglossia and possible acromegaly, a hormonal disorder that can cause abnormal growth in bones and tissue. He was not simply a sickly prince. He was the living embodiment of a dynasty rotting from the inside out. 17th century witnesses could only describe what stood before them. A king whose face looked as though it had been sculpted by a vengeful god, a cruel punishment for generations of familial arrogance. Foreign diplomats often left behind written accounts, not of admiration, but of shock and revulsion. The Venetian ambassador noted that Charles's mouth hung permanently open, like a fish gasping on land. The French envoy described his speech as resembling the gurgle of a drowning man. Even Spain's allies struggled to disguise their discomfort. Every royal meal was a macabre performance. Charles could not chew solid food. His upper and lower teeth didn't align, not at all. The top row sat so far behind the bottom that normal chewing was impossible. His jaw wasn't just misaligned. It was fundamentally non-functional. In response, the royal kitchens were forced to prepare every dish like infant food. Everything Charles ate was pureed, mashed, or turned into liquid. And even then, eating was slow, clumsy, and humiliating. Soup leaked from the corners of his mouth. Any chunks of food simply tumbled back out. Royal banquets, intended to impress and awe, instead became disturbing spectacles. Servants stood ready with cloths, constantly dabbing saliva from their king's chin as he struggled to get food down. The emotional toll of this ritual was devastating. Charles knew what people saw. He knew how they reacted. Court records show that he often refused to eat in public, choosing to go hungry rather than endure the stares and pity. This self-imposed starvation led to chronic malnutrition, which further weakened his already fragile health. But if eating was a humiliation, speaking was an agony. His jaw deformity didn't just interfere with chewing. It made clear speech nearly impossible. Each attempt at communication became a blur of wet, slurred syllables. Even those closest to him struggled to understand. Foreign envoys required interpreters, not because of Spanish, but because they simply couldn't make sense of the king's voice. The tragedy was not just in his appearance, but in how completely his own body betrayed him, every hour of every day. Important matters of state had to be handled through written correspondence, because verbal communication was nearly impossible. This was not just a personal inconvenience, it was a constitutional crisis. How could a monarch govern if his subjects couldn't understand him? Palace scribes were forced to work overtime, transcribing the king's garbled mutterings into official decrees. But even they often had to guess at the intended meaning, piecing together meaning from context and tone rather than from words. The most heartbreaking insights, however, came not from diplomats or courtiers, but from Charles himself. In rare moments of lucidity, he would write letters in his own shaky hand. These letters reveal a man tormented by the disconnect between mind and body. In one such note, now preserved in a Spanish archive, he wrote, "I am a prisoner in my own flesh, and God has made me king of the greatest empire on earth as some cosmic jest." But Charles's disfigured jaw was just the beginning. His entire body was a medical catastrophe, the kind that would have made even medieval villagers cross themselves in fear. At 35 years old, Charles resembled a sickly child, unnaturally stretched and twisted, as if shaped by some cruel experiment. He stood barely 5 feet tall, but height was the least of it. His proportions were so deeply abnormal that he looked assembled from mismatched parts. His head was disproportionately large, lolling atop a neck so frail it could scarcely support the weight. His limbs were skeletal, his torso compressed and hunched, and his posture permanently bent, as if he were carrying a burden invisible to everyone but himself. Most disturbing of all, Charles's body seemed to be breaking down over time. While most people reach physical maturity and level off, his condition only deteriorated with age. He couldn't walk until he was 8, almost a full decade behind a normal child. Imagine that. Most toddlers take their first steps around their first birthday. Charles spent the better part of a decade unable to support his own weight. And even once he managed to walk, it was hardly more than a stagger. Witnesses described him lurching from one wall to another, using furniture for balance, moving not like a young man in his prime, but like a feeble elder. His spine, bent into a severe curve, forced him into a perpetual hunch, giving him the silhouette of someone forever carrying an invisible curse. And in many ways, he truly was the walking sum of centuries of genetic decay, concentrated into one tragically unfortunate human being. The psychological toll was just as harrowing. Charles II possessed the mind of a child well into adulthood. He did not learn to read until the age of 10, and even then, his comprehension remained severely limited. Court tutors described educating him as like pouring water into a cracked jug. Information would enter, but nothing remained. His emotional state mirrored that of a toddler, volatile, fragile, and unpredictable. Servants recorded frequent tantrums, violent outbursts, triggered by trivial frustrations. He would scream, flail, and weep uncontrollably over small inconveniences, as though he were a young child denied a toy. These fits were often followed by long spells of eerie silence, during which he would sit completely still, staring into nothingness, unresponsive and unreachable. Even his appearance betrayed his broken inheritance. Charles's hair grew in thin, uneven patches, falling out in clumps and leaving his scalp mottled and raw, more like the hide of a diseased animal than the crown of a European monarch. Court painters, tasked with immortalizing him in regal portraits, were forced to exercise extraordinary artistic license. But even their most imaginative flourishes could not fully conceal the peculiar, almost spectral appearance of the king. His skin was pale and waxen, marred by persistent, unexplained rashes that defied treatment. Court physicians recorded that he was often freezing cold, even during the sweltering summers of Spain. He required layers of heavy garments to stay warm, clothing that only exaggerated his already distorted physique. And then there was the odor. Multiple court records refer to a strange and persistent smell that seemed to follow the king. It wasn't overtly foul, but it was unnatural a scent that disturbed those nearby. Some likened it to the smell of something rotting from within. Modern experts believe this may have stemmed from metabolic disorders, a byproduct of the extreme inbreeding that had corrupted his genes. But the tragedy of Charles II did not end with his own suffering. His condition triggered a continental crisis. The most powerful throne in Europe had been inherited by a man incapable of producing an heir. This was more than personal misfortune. It was a dynastic disaster that would eventually tear Europe apart. Charles married twice, each time with the desperate hope of continuing the Habsburg line, of fulfilling the most basic royal duty, to leave behind a successor. But fate and genetics would not allow it. Charles's first marriage was meant to be a political triumph, a union between the great houses of France and Spain. His bride, Marie-Louise of Orleans, arrived full of hope. A princess of charm and intelligence, she had been raised with the expectation that she would one day become queen to one of the most powerful rulers in the world. What she found instead was a tragic illusion of kingship. Behind the glittering facade of the Spanish crown stood a man who, in the whispered words of courtiers, was barely a man at all. The wedding night was, by all accounts, a catastrophe. Servants later testified that Marie-Louise emerged from the royal bedchamber in tears. Charles himself was confused, distressed, and clearly unaware of what was expected of him. The physical deformities that had ravaged Charles's body extended to his most private parts. Contemporary doctors, though limited in their understanding, described his reproductive organs as undeveloped, infantile. In essence, Charles had the sexual maturity of a child, incapable of consummating the marriage in any meaningful sense. But in the political world of 17th century Europe, acknowledging the king's impotence was unthinkable. So, the court chose an easier scapegoat. They blamed Marie-Louise. Rather than confront the truth, the Spanish court accused her of being barren. She was subjected to a barrage of humiliations, invasive medical examinations, endless folk remedies, and constant spiritual interventions. Physicians prescribed bitter herbal tonics, administered painful procedures, and made her undergo ritual fasting to balance the humors. Nothing worked because nothing could. Charles was biologically incapable of producing an heir, but Marie-Louise bore the weight of the empire's frustration. The toll on her spirit was immense. Once described as joyful and witty, the young queen gradually fell into silence and sadness. She turned to prayer, often weeping alone for hours in the royal chapel, begging for a miracle that would never come. Some modern historians believe that the so-called fertility treatments she was forced to endure may have slowly poisoned her. Her private letters to her family in France speak volumes filled with sorrow, helplessness, and a growing sense of entrapment. She referred to Charles as more pitiful than frightening, and described her marriage as being bound to a ghost, someone who lived, but only just, someone who suffered by existing. When Marie-Louise died suddenly at the age of 26, official records blamed appendicitis. But whispers within the palace told another story: suicide, or perhaps a long, slow death caused by the very cures meant to help her. After her death, the veil of science and medicine was lifted, and the court turned to the supernatural. When Charles's condition continued to worsen, and no doctor could provide answers, the Spanish court looked elsewhere, to God, and to demons. What followed were some of the most bizarre, unsettling, and tragic religious rituals ever conducted within a European royal court. Public exorcisms were held inside the palace itself. Clergymen gathered to confront what they believed was a demonic possession. Charles's grotesque physical state, his inability to produce an heir, his mental instability, it all had to mean one thing: he was cursed. The church provided a chillingly simple answer. The devil had claimed the King of Spain. The diagnosis was simple. Charles wasn't just sick, he was possessed. According to Father Antonio Fernandez Dandaras, the royal court's chief exorcist, the King of Spain had become the vessel for multiple demonic entities, introduced into his body through witchcraft, not merely an illness, not even a curse, but an intentional acta, satanic attack upon the Spanish crown itself. But what happened next is the stuff of dark legend. These weren't quiet. Backroom rituals whispered in secrecy. No, these were spectacles grand. Theatrical exorcisms staged right in the royal throne room, in front of horrified nobles, foreign diplomats, and visiting dignitaries. This was the face of power in decline. A monarch writhing on the marble floor, foaming at the mouth, while priests shrieked Latin incantations and pressed crucifixes to his twitching limbs. The air reeked of incense and desperation. Father Danderous would begin each exorcism by forcing Charles to drink holy water laced with pulverized relics, tiny bone fragments from saints' corpses, ground up into cloudy sediment. It was foul, nearly undrinkable, but drink it he did. And almost instantly, Charles would collapse into fits of vomiting and spasms. His fragile body couldn't tolerate what was essentially muddy water infused with calcium dust and rot. The priests, of course, saw these violent reactions not as poisoning, but as proof. The demons are resisting. The devils are fighting back. At times, Charles would lose consciousness entirely. Other times, he would convulse on the palace floor for hours, choking, muttering, sobbing. The exorcists interpreted every twitch, every retch, every scream as a sign of victory, evidence that they were, inch by inch, clawing the evil out of the king's corrupted soul. But Charles wasn't just spiritually broken. He was terrified. He had no understanding of Latin. His ability to reason was already limited. So when priests demanded that he repeat sacred incantations he couldn't comprehend, he panicked. He stumbled over words, slurred prayers, mispronounced names, and each mistake was taken as another sign of demonic resistance. The rituals became increasingly brutal. Crucifixes were held to his chest until they left red, blistered impressions. He was doused in ice-cold holy water that soaked his already frail body. Priests would grab his arms and legs, shaking him, screaming for the devils to name themselves. Foreign envoys who witnessed the scenes were horrified. One Venetian diplomat wrote in his private journal that he had seen battlefield executions more humane than what Spain did to its own king. But the madness didn't stop with Charles. Father Danderous began to believe that the entire royal palace was infested with evil. In 1698, he ordered what would become one of the most bizarre operations in royal history: a full-scale spiritual cleansing of the Spanish monarchy seat of power. Hundreds of rooms were sealed, fumigated with holy incense. Statues were washed in holy water. Crucifixes were nailed to every doorway. Priests marched through the halls chanting day and night, sprinkling salt and relic dust into the very foundations of the building. They burned effigies of Satan in the palace gardens. They destroyed tapestries, books, and anything that looked remotely unclean. The royal kitchens were exorcised. The stables were exorcised. Even the royal bedchambers, the most private sanctuaries of the Spanish crown, were treated like dens of the devil. And at the center of it all, Charles II, trembling, confused, exhausted, was still no closer to being healed. The exorcisms didn't restore his strength. They didn't clear his mind. They didn't grant him an heir, but they did something else. They revealed to all of Europe that Spain's mighty empire, once feared and envied, was now ruled by superstition, desperation, and a dying king who had become a spectacle of horror. And so the fires burned. Royal possessions, gifts from emperors, heirlooms from queens, centuries of priceless artifacts were dragged out into the courtyard and set alight. Servants wept as they cast embroidered gowns, ancient scrolls, and gilded icons into the flames. Smoke billowed thick and black above the palace walls, curling into the sky like a dark omen. From the streets of Madrid, it looked as though the palace was under siege, but there were no foreign invaders, no revolution, no war. Just a broken king, burning his own past, convinced that evil lived in the lace of his mother's handkerchiefs, in the legs of an old chair, in the velvet cushion of a throne he could barely sit upon. And tragically, it worked. Or at least, Charles believed it did. The priests told him that the pain in his joints was easing, that the fire had frightened the demons, that God was watching him with pride. And Charles, fragile, exhausted, desperate for hope, believed them. He would smile for a day. He would eat a spoonful of soup without shaking, and then the pain would return. And so he begged for more exorcisms, more fire, more holy water, more bone dust and relics, crushed and mixed into the chalice. Palace records show that in the final 5 years of his life, Charles underwent more than 50 full-scale exorcisms. Each one drained him further mentally, physically, spiritually. He began to hallucinate. He heard voices at night. He mistook his own reflection for demons. His speech, once merely garbled, became unintelligible entirely. At times, he forgot his own name. By the final year, Charles was a ghost in royal garments, sunken-eyed, silent, and barely breathing. Courtiers avoided him. Diplomats sent home reports of a dying empire. And Spain, the once great superpower of Europe, was now held together by silence, pity, and delusion. And then he died. November 1st, 1700, the Day of the Dead. Charles II, last of the Spanish Habsburgs, passed quietly in the royal Alcazar, surrounded not by family, but by priests. His final rites were whispered over a body, so wasted that his heart weighed barely 100 grams. His brain was said to be soft and deformed. His intestines were rotted, his lungs shriveled. His testicles, the doctors noted, were black as coal and no larger than a bean. The great royal autopsy was a horror story of its own. But the truth had long been visible in the way he walked, the way he spoke, the way he was hidden from the world. Charles had been the last domino in a line too long, too proud, and too blind to stop itself. The Habsburgs believed they could defy biology, that power and blood were interchangeable, that purity meant strength. But instead, it brought silence, madness, and death. And when Charles died without an heir, his empire died with him. Within months, Europe exploded into war, the War of the Spanish Succession, a brutal contest over who would sit on a throne no longer held by a man, but by a memory. Thousands would die, orders would shift, dynasties would rise and fall, all because one boy born of kings and queens was never allowed to be simply human. But perhaps the saddest truth is this: Charles II wasn't a monster. He wasn't possessed. He wasn't cursed. He was a child born into a legacy too heavy for any human body to carry, shaped by centuries of fear masquerading as tradition, a life devoured by the ambitions of those long dead. And tonight, as you drift into sleep, remember, even the most powerful empires can be undone not by war or rebellion, but by silence, shame, and the belief that blood alone can shape the world. They believed their blood was sacred, not just royal, not just noble, sacred, that mingling it with lesser lines would taint the divine order. That power could be distilled like wine, stronger, pure, more potent with each generation. But they were wrong, catastrophically wrong. And Charles II paid the price, not just in the body he was forced to inhabit, but in the life he was never truly allowed to live. His twisted spine and shattered jaw were not accidents. They were verdicts, nature's quiet, unrelenting judgment on centuries of human hubris, on a family that thought itself above the laws of biology, on a dynasty so afraid of dilution that it chose collapse instead. We still see echoes of this thinking today. In isolated communities where marriage remains confined to bloodlines, rates of genetic disorder rise. In elite families, where alliances are sealed within a narrow circle, harmful recessive traits continue to echo down generations. Wherever genetic isolation takes hold, collapse is never far behind. It's not cruelty. It's not punishment. It's just math, biology, inevitable. Charles II's body wasn't just sick, it was symbolic. His bones were history's ledger. His organs were the cost. His face, so famously misshapen, was not a curse. It was a receipt, stamped and signed by evolution itself. The cruelest irony? That Charles, the most genetically pure Habsburg, was also the most powerless. After centuries of carefully arranged marriages, alliances built like equations, he emerged not as a god-king, but as a man who could not walk without help, could not eat without shame, could not produce a child, could not even speak without confusion. He was meant to be the pinnacle of a perfect line. Instead, he became its undoing, the final act of a tragedy centuries in the making. And so when we look at his portraits today, in museums, in history books, behind protective glass, we are not just seeing a monarch. We are seeing a warning. Etched in pigment, framed in gold, hidden behind royal robes and flattened curls. That no power is worth the price of blindness. That no empire can last if it forgets the body that must carry the crown. And that even the greatest thrones in history are just chairs waiting to be empty. Sleep well, and let the past rest, at last, where it belongs. And so it ended, not with a war or an assassin's blade or a grand betrayal, but with a whisper, a flickering breath. A man who never truly lived, slipping quietly into death, his crown too heavy, his bloodline too thin, his empire too fragile to carry on. Charles II did not lose his kingdom in battle. He lost it in the womb long before he could ever lift a sword or speak a law or father a child. He was never the architect of Spain's fall. He was its final symptom. And when the candle of his life finally went out, it didn't just end a reign. It ended a world.